Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us here at Hudson. My name is Michael Sobolik. I'm a senior fellow here, joined by a distinguished panel, which we'll introduce momentarily. Before we get into the event and the discussion to come, let's step back and evaluate this conversation of foreign assistance, great power competition, and specifically how malaria fits into everything. It's a critical moment that we're in right now, one that is reshaping how our country, the United States, engages with the world with foreign assistance. And this competition between Washington and Beijing, more specifically the Chinese Communist Party, intensifies. The spotlight in our conversations often falls on trade, technology, military strength, for very understandable reasons. But a quieter and equally consequential front is playing out elsewhere in the domain of foreign assistance. From the Pacific Islands to sub-Saharan Africa, the CCP is advancing a clear, consistent message to governments caught between Washington and Beijing. If you walk away from the United States, you'll get a better deal with China. And this isn't new. I mean, before this tariff trade war, tit for tat, that we're in the middle of right now, Beijing has already been working to replace the United States as the preferred partner of the developing world and increasingly the developed world too. And Beijing's message is backed not just by rhetoric, but by loans, infrastructure, and increasingly health programs. This battleground that we are encountering day to day isn't just with ports, railways, or 5G towers. It's also with hospitals, health systems, and something as specific as mosquito nets. China has made foreign assistance a tool of statecraft and part of a broader campaign to shift the focus away from Washington toward Beijing, the center of global leadership from the West to the East, and realign international partnerships in that way. And that includes a growing focus on malaria. Malaria is one of the world's deadliest diseases. It kills hundreds of thousands each year and affects millions more. It destabilizes fragile states. It kills hundreds of thousands, threatens economic development, leaves entire regions vulnerable to emerging pandemics. Countering malaria is about saving lives, to be sure, but it's also about more than that. It's about building resilience, earning trust, and strengthening partnerships in regions that matter to U.S. national security and foreign policy. And China sees this too. In recent years, the CCP has ramped up malaria-related initiatives throughout Africa, not out of altruism, but as part of a broader plan to expand influence, extract resources, and create dependencies. And that's why when we talk about foreign assistance, including public health, this is part of a broader competition between two systems that we are living in the midst of right now. And the question is not whether aid should be reformed. It should, and the Trump administration is in the middle of that right now. The question is what kind of aid reflects America's values and plays to our strengths. And malaria is at the heart and center of those questions. So with that, I'm honored to facilitate this conversation. Hudson is honored to host this conversation with a panel as esteemed as this. And I'd like to introduce our panelists now. To my immediate left is the Honorable Ted Yoho, the former United States Representative for the 3rd District of Florida, who was a leader in his time on the Hill on all things U.S.-China related, on America's leadership in the Indo-Pacific. Have a great deal of respect for the congressman, and it's a real pleasure to be sitting with you. I appreciate it. So thank you. To further down the line, Aaron Hope is the editor of China Brief at Jamestown Foundation. China Brief is one of the more esteemed and the most highly reputed sources of analysis in the city on China, and I've gotten to know Aaron a bit over the past few months, and I'm really, really thrilled to have him up here to offer his expertise, so thank you. And then at the end of the line, last but certainly not least, Dr. Ken Staley, who was the former U.S. Global Malaria coordinator, a distinguished public servant, and one of the most accomplished and I would venture to say, I think one of the most intelligent and smartest people when it comes to how the United States combats a disease as deadly as malaria. So it's a real pleasure and honor to have you and your expertise up here, sir. Thank you. The way this event is going to proceed, we are going to have a moderated discussion for the first roughly half or so of the event. And then once I have asked my questions and expelled my prerogative as moderator, we want to bring the whole room into this. So once we have a conversation to kick things off, we'll bring those of you here in person, and then we'll have a more wholesome conversation. Congressman Yoho, I want to start with you. During your time in Congress, just zooming out to a high-level perspective, looking at foreign assistance and public health programs, how have you viewed the role of foreign assistance in U.S. foreign policy and national security? Have you always been a believer in the value of foreign aid and the role that it plays for the United States?
No. When I came to Congress, one of my rallying cries at different meetings was get rid of foreign aid, and everybody cheered. And when I got up here, I learned quickly how ignorant I was, because I didn't know there were good programs and bad programs. I just thought it was all bad. We needed to get rid of it. Why are we spending money on this? And I hear that today. But then when you find out about some of these programs, some of the good programs that are effective, they're efficient, and they do go, and this is before Rubio's saying that we need to make America safer, stronger, and more prosperous. These things were already doing that. They were building bridges. They were that form of soft diplomacy that is so vital for us. We're on this planet with a lot of people, and we're all intertwined or interconnected. And I think you all are familiar with the butterfly effect, the ripple effect. How do you get away from that? I mean, which program do you get away? I want to take you back to, I think it was January 28, 1986. I was out on a farm, northern Alachua, we're in my district, and the shuttle went up. And we're all looking at it and said, wow, that's just beautiful. And then it blew up. I don't know if I see a lot of people here, probably not old enough to remember that, but I did. And it was what caused that. Well, after the investigation, you know what it was, right? It was a rubber O-ring that had froze. So the most insignificant thing sometimes is the most important thing. And so foreign aid, you have to go ahead and make these programs. You have to look at them all. And the ones that aren't really moving us, to make us stronger, safer, more prosperous, but it's not just us, it's those countries we're investing in. And I don't look at it as an expense if it's an efficient and effective program. I look at it as an investment. And so I'll stop with that.
Moving to a more specific subset of foreign assistance, malaria itself. Ken, I want to come down to you now. There's a plethora of diseases in this world. There are a lot of problems, even if we buy into the notion that foreign assistance matters and it rebounds to the benefit of Americans, which I think we all believe it does. Why malaria? What makes this particular disease so unique and important to focus in on and devote considerable resources to combating?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think, I'd start with the history of malaria. So malaria is one of the world's oldest and most deadly diseases. It's killed hundreds of millions of people over the course of human history. And it still is a deadly disease for some of the poorest in the world. So in sub-Saharan Africa, it still kills over 500,000 people a year. There are millions of cases every year. And that leads to significant societal and economic disruption. And that societal and economic disruption really is a negative for the world. Now, the great thing about what we can do about malaria is that there are treatments and preventions available. And not only are there treatments and preventions available, they're very cost effective. So a rapid diagnostic test costs less than $1. Treatment costs less than $2. And preventing the mosquitoes that carry the parasite, that infect people, bed nets cost just a few dollars each. So there's a tremendous gain for a moderate investment for the people of the world. And on top of that, I think if you look at what's happened in the world, in the United States, We used to have malaria in the Ohio River Valley. We had it in Washington, D.C. Right. We had it across the South. In 1951, we eliminated malaria in the United States. And just in the last 10 years, 13 other countries have eliminated malaria. So there's now 44 countries that are malaria-free. So the idea that we can eliminate this disease is real, and we can push forward with it with focus. And that would be an accomplishment on par with eliminating smallpox.
Wow, incredible. There's, I think, a through line between these first two answers so far. Like anything in public policy and even foreign policy, there's dangers and threats, but the flip side of that is an opportunity. And the opportunity that you just laid out is moving forward towards maybe in the long term or medium term eradication at a larger scale, which is certainly wonderful. But Aaron, this is where I want to bring you in, because opportunities can be perceived very differently from different actors who see the same situation. So the opportunity that we see of eradicating or at least containing the spread, controlling the deadliness of a disease, how does the People's Republic of China view something like malaria? And not just combating the disease itself, but how does malaria fit into China's global strategy with what it's trying to accomplish and what it's doing in Africa, more specifically?
Sure, yeah. And I think on that point, it's worth going back to something that you said in your introduction, Michael, that a lot of, China does not view aid in the same way that the West does. And this is, wrapped up in a broader approach as they've been able to build their comprehensive national power, especially in the last 15 years. There's been a sense that they need to contribute more to the global public goods as a way of reflecting its increase in national power in the international order. But China does not view its foreign aid predominantly as something that it donates to partner countries. It very much sees it as a way of furthering its own interests and increasingly locking global South countries into its own preferences as it starts to build an alternative vision of a Chinese-led international order. So this is where part of the US-China competition comes in, and where things that should be seen as global public goods, public health, eradicating malaria is actually seen as another battleground by the party. They see this as a battleground for increasing their own preferences. They've capitalized on this in the last kind of month or so. I was doing some research for this panel, and I discovered that April 25th was World Malaria Day. How did I find out about this? Because there was an article in the People's Daily, the party's flagship newspaper, talking about this. And they were talking about China's own experiences eradicating malaria, which they managed to do in 2021 after thousands of years dealing with the disease. And they're proactively using this narrative of their own experience as a quote-unquote developing country to kind of promote their own way of solving malaria to African countries and the rest of the global South that continue to suffer from the disease. So that's just one way in which they're trying to shape the narrative rhetorically, even though they contribute, I think, something like 14% as much to these kind of efforts as the US spends. They're nevertheless trying to promote themselves as a leader in this area.
So actually, one follow-up question for you on China right now. There's talk of, I can't remember when this was formally announced, it's their Health Silk Road, which is, of course, a subset of Beijing's broader Belt and Road Initiative, Xi Jinping's pet foreign policy project. How does countering malaria more specifically fit into something like the Health Silk Road? And I guess another way to ask that, to move beyond the buzzword of something like a Health Silk Road, which Americans can hear something like that and we think, okay, that sounds weird, right? What is the Health Silk Road? And when you talk about how Beijing views foreign assistance differently, it's not grants, it's loans, maybe there's an expectation on the other side of it. Maybe could you speak a little more about what the world that the Chinese Communist Party hopes to build? Practically, what might that look like?
Yeah, sure. So as the name suggests, the Health Silk Road is part of the broader Belt and Road Initiative, which was kind of launched in a kind of low-key way in 2013, but really kind of came into its own around 2015, which is when the Health Silk Road Initiative itself was launched. It is really seen as part of this broader framework of trying to, it's a determined effort to project China's civilizational influence and Chinese wisdom as part of its efforts to kind of rebuild the global order in its own image. And so the Health Silk Road really, it focused on kind of three main things. One is promoting Chinese standards, so being able to shape and kind of build medical standards and norms. And you see that throughout international institutions, the WHO, which endorsed it in 2017, in UN bodies as well, where countries have signed on to party rhetoric on these kind of things. You tend to see Chinese preferences reflected more in institutions that are kind of more weighed in those countries' favor. Another part of it is markets. Obviously, a large part of the Belt and Road Initiative originally was to find foreign markets for the overcapacity problem and kind of domestic manufacturing sort of spillover. And you see that increasingly in the pharmaceutical space, medical space, biotech as well, which is an emerging area of strategic competition. African countries and other countries who can sign on to these initiatives are seen as potential markets. And then, there's probably another aspect to this, which maybe some of my colleagues are better placed to talk about, which is potential access to medical data from the facilities that are being set up and used there. And the broader piece, which I guess we talked about already, is the ability to promote Chinese influence more broadly across the world.
And real quick, you touched on something so important that I briefly want to foot stomp. The biotech sector is not just going to be this question of public health and fighting diseases. The way that the party is approaching biotechnology is with at least one objective of actively harming Americans. And I think this is something that Americans need to understand with something like public health. It isn't just this altruistic domain. There's evidence of companies in China taking a generic over-the-counter drug, slightly changing it either to weaken it or to make it non-effective, or in some cases to swap out medicines but keep the label on it in ways that would imperil American consumers if you go to CVS expecting to get one drug but getting another. I've had meetings in the past week with people that are alerting policymakers in Washington of how the CCP is approaching this. And it's visceral. It's visceral. It's not just this, it's more than just a competition. It has potential deadly implications. And Congressman Yoho, I think this is something that maybe many Americans don't understand, that when we talk about something that can feel as removed as foreign assistance, or maybe as removed as malaria, because as you and others have said, we eradicated this disease so long ago inside of our own country. And it could be easy to hear all these things, but then still to come away with this perception of what you're talking about is a problem that's a world away from me, whether you're in Ohio or Nevada or North Carolina. If you were to speak to an average voter, middle-class voter anywhere, working-class voter, they pay their taxes and they want America to be strong, but they understandably don't think about these things. How would you translate this to make sense for their daily life?
That's a great question. I had a good friend of mine, and he's highly educated, heart surgeon, world-renowned. And we got talking, we got talking about foreign policy. He goes, Ted, nobody cares about foreign affairs and foreign policy. I said, sure they do, Tom. And I started naming some of the things. He goes, yeah, I guess that makes sense, whether it's energy, health, rare earth minerals, things like that. When somebody else controls those commodities, it's a real important thing. And the thing that got me involved in foreign affairs was the Iran oil embargo. I was young, had hair. And when that happened, I remember Iran was the culprit from America's perspective. And I'm like, where is Iran? I don't even know where it is. And, so how can a country halfway across the world influence the price of gas? It doubled overnight, and then what got rationed. And so foreign policy is extremely important. And I feel that the Foreign Affairs Committee is, if I'm biased, is the most important committee on the Hill, because if you have good foreign policy, it ties into good domestic policy. It ties extremely into trade policies. And if you have those two things, that ties into strong national security. So it's imperative that we do that. And dropping back to China, I think it's been documented very well or explained very well here. There's a competition going on. One is a very authoritarian, where it's the Chinese Communist Party. It's the Communist Party. I know they like to talk about socialism with Chinese characteristics. It's communism. All right, so that's one form that is being spread, and then there's the liberal democracies. And that's the competition we're in, and you're talking about China, the Health Road.
Health Silk Road.
Silk Road. You guys are all aware, I'm sure, of the on-demand organ harvesting, right? This is something that there's been hearings in the Senate back in 2012, I think it was, where they're taking certain populations, whether it's the Uyghurs or the Falun Gong, and if they need a kidney and it matches, they take you off the street and they do this. Well, if you have another kidney they want to take, well, you've only got two, so you know what the end result of that is. But that's part of that Health Silk Road. So I'm going to ask the free world, anybody that's listening, why are we doing business with China? Somebody that does that. We would not accept that anywhere else. Our manufacturers are over there. This is a competition that I think it comes down to right versus wrong, or good versus evil. And I know that's pretty harsh, but that's really what's going on. And their role is to be the world hegemon, both economically and military, and have the Han philosophies rule the world. So I think this is a game we can't afford to back off. And as we back out of foreign assistance, that void is filled. Nature abhors a vacuum, and that void is being filled by people. I don't think people are really sure who they are. It's good to have assistance, but it's not always good assistance. So I think we need to really tighten up our game here and work at bringing these effective programs back sooner than later.
You mentioned the Senate and some of the leadership that members in that chamber have taken in China, not in any way to overlook your preferred chamber where you gave your public service.
That was the people's house.
That's right, the people's house, not the elitist house. But one of the foremost leaders in the Senate until recently, when he left the Senate, was Marco Rubio, now the Secretary of State, in addition to the three other titles that he currently has right now. Ken, I want to come back to you right now, because when Secretary Rubio had his confirmation hearing, I believe it was the same day President Trump was sworn in, or maybe he was confirmed that same day, I can't remember. But he is one of the foremost China hawks in DC, and I would venture to say a realist of the Chinese Communist Party. He understands this regime for what it is. But he did more than talk about U.S.-China competition in his confirmation hearing. He talked about malaria specifically. And he did it, I think, in a way that was very unprompted, in a way where he was talking about the successes of U.S. foreign assistance. It was noticeable because he didn't really go out of his way to mentioning other specific programs. So given your experience in the first Trump administration with leading to counter malaria, what was behind Secretary Rubio going out of his way to highlight malaria specifically? As someone who is a China hawk like himself, why does someone like Marco Rubio care about malaria?
Yeah, well, I think it starts with what the program's success has been. So when you look at what's occurred since we started this very concentrated effort, we've saved over 13 million lives on the continent of Africa. We've prevented 2 billion cases of malaria on the continent, and we've cut the death rate by half across all these countries in sub-Saharan Africa. So we've been successful in this initial foreign aid mission. But more than that, that success is a game changer for us when we speak to foreign officials. So when you speak to ambassadors who've served over in Africa and they speak to their counterparts, their counterparts know that we are helping them with a problem that we don't have ourselves, that we're doing this with goodwill and openness. That builds trust, that builds opportunities to collaborate and form partnerships, and that's led, I think, to a lot of collaboration across key areas for American national security, be that trade, be that combating ISIS and other violent extremists on the continent, or even more importantly, as we're discussing today, combating the malign influence of China and its Belt and Road Initiative across Africa. So, there's been tremendous value in the public health impact of what we've done, but it's had incredible benefit for our national security goals as well. And it doesn't stop there. I think it's also protected Americans at home in a few different ways. So, we are reducing the likelihood that malaria cases will come from other places to the United States. With all the work we do in the field in Africa, we now have an early warning system that if there's a new disease, an outbreak of Ebola or Marburg or some new pandemic potential disease, we're able to have an alert that stops that disease outbreak from becoming a catastrophe for a country or a pandemic for the world. And I think just as importantly, the platform technologies that we've developed, especially around mosquito control for use in malaria, are being used now to combat diseases we're thinking about in the United States. Zika and dengue fever both have technologies now that are being applied because of the work we've started in malaria. The last thing I'd say is, from a prosperity perspective, we've had a lot of innovation. I mentioned some of it just before that. That innovation creates products that then go from our shores to the shores of Africa. So, to sum it up, there is a public health benefit, and the direct goals of the program have been met over and over with great success. But the additional benefits, I think, are really pretty unparalleled across other foreign aid programs.
Yeah, yes.
Yeah, I just wanted to jump on the back of that. And I think the party is very clear-eyed about seeing the soft power benefits of involvement in malaria, right? And as you were saying earlier, it's a very cost-effective way of improving your international reputation. And I think especially apposite to be talking about this the day after Joseph Nye passed away, who was the kind of main theorist of soft power, right? For the last few decades. I was chatting to a friend who works at the UN on development stuff and peacekeeping yesterday, and he was saying that already there's instances, going back to what you were saying about seizing opportunities, of clinics in Tanzania which were previously funded by USAID, where China Aid, which is the China's version, which was set up in 2018, I believe, has stuck their own China Aid stickers on top of the USAID stickers. So they're clearly trying to, I don't think anybody believes that they're going to be able to step in where the US is maybe stepping back, but they're clearly trying to seize opportunities where it makes sense for them to do so.
Building off of that comment, question to the whole panel. Anyone who wants to jump in first, please feel free to. Even if, to your point, Aaron, even if the Chinese Communist Party is unsuccessful in truly replacing or replicating what USAID was doing in those efforts, just by virtue of being present and having the sticker to put there, how maybe in the next few months, in the next year, what does keeping trust look like for the United States? Because obviously the Trump administration is in the middle of a reevaluation, safer, stronger, more prosperous, as one of you mentioned earlier. What does keeping and maintaining trust with these partner nations look like, specifically with malaria? Yeah.
It's imperative. I've learned, and I'm sure everybody else here knows that, as you do, whether it's business, or relationships, or governments, people want to do business with people they, number one, know, they like, and they trust. Once you break one of those, you weaken the whole thing. And I think we have to make sure, and we've broken trust with a lot of the things that have happened since the first of the year. Can we get it back? Yeah, you can. But when you had adversaries fighting against you and saying, you can't trust those people, they let you down, they walked away. And I think that's a great poke in the eye when you said they put their sticker over our USAID sticker. That had to be intentionally, and I probably would have done the same thing. You just want to let them know you're there. And then these programs are all intertwined, and I was saying, which one do you get rid of? You can't have a healthy person that's suffering from not even infected with anything if they're malnourished. We've got that program with the RUTFs, the ready-to-use therapeutic foods. Those are programs that builds a person's body up, that builds their immunity up. So that's a great program. Then you have organizations like CEPI that are going around monitoring the next emergent possible zoonotics, but they're doing research on the ones that are already there. Then you have organizations like Gavi that are boots on the ground, that are distributing vaccines and doing that work and doing the clinical tests. I think there was, 263 million tests done on malaria, and I think it's driven the cost down to like 27 cents a test. Yeah. I mean, we have the technology, we have the know-how, we have the resources. It's just implementing it, and then it's also getting the buy-in of those foreign countries to take up the mantle and say, this is our problem. And I think working together with people they know, like, and trust, we can come forward in that. I'm going to say the liberal democracies, but I like for us to lead it because I think that's who we are as Americans. It ties into our values as a nation.
Ken and Aaron, one more question for each of you before we open it up for questions. Ken, the reality is building and maintaining trust is one imperative, but there is another. With the future moving forward, it is assured that something is going to be different about U.S. foreign assistance. What will be different is still being figured out and deliberated upon, but something that there will be changes. As you look at the future of combating malaria within this rubric of safer, stronger, more prosperous for America, what are the changes or the refined emphases or the direction that you think a safer, stronger, more prosperous counter-malaria initiative for the United States that is built on that foundation of trust, what does that look like?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I would say it looks like taking advantage of the lessons we've learned in the past when we created this last iteration of our malaria efforts. And it also means adopting some of the newest technologies to accelerate our ability to assist these countries. And as Congressman Yoho mentioned, making sure that we are doing this in a way that we are true partners and helping people to step up and help themselves. So just to put a fine point on it, 21 years ago when we were combating malaria, we had hundreds of people working on malaria around the globe with many different people in charge of little pots of money. And when all was said and done, there was very little to show for it. So when this last initiative was created, the first principle was that there was a single person in government who had only one responsibility, and that was malaria control and eradication. And that person had a budget that they controlled, and they had line authority over all of the assets that were being deployed across different parts of the US government. That resulted in a very effective ability to implement. On top of that, we put metrics in place to make sure that that person and that organization measured themselves and were held accountable by the executive branch and the Congress in a very public way. So I think we take that lesson of the leadership structure and we make sure that we replicate it in the next iteration of what we're doing. The second thing I'd say is we have to make sure we continue to maintain our focus. So, we've expanded our programs in some cases to where we're funding at suboptimal levels. We have to make sure that we have an optimal level of funding to make a significant impact in the countries we care about. And just to put a fine point on it, 95% of malaria cases and almost 95% of deaths are occurring in sub-Saharan Africa. Just 4 countries, though, account for almost half of the deaths. That's Nigeria, Niger, DRC, and Tanzania. All 4 of them are tremendous strategic partners for the United States in areas that I outlined before. So I think making sure that we have the right leadership structure and the right powers, making sure that we're focusing our resources in the right way. And then the last thing I'd say is, just as we did 20 years ago when we really pushed the envelope on the technologies we were starting to apply, we need to go back and double down. There is so much data that is generated every year in our fight to control malaria. This is a huge opportunity for us with our advantage in AI and compute to utilize the data to drive better and faster results. So that's how I would think about it.
You mentioned integrating technology and AI in particular, and as I was doing my own preparation for this panel and my own research, one of the things that struck me is not only the need to make sure that we infuse our own approach to fighting diseases like malaria with the latest technologies, but also to make sure that as the CCP is on the ground as well, that we are doing what we can to provide alternatives to their technologies. Because with the advent of DeepSeek and Beijing's approach to open AI systems that they make available to anyone who wants to use them and integrate them into, like, literally layer it on top of pre-existing technology, that's going to be another piece of this, is making sure that the systems that we're using in these countries are ones that are not just developed by like our companies because that's good for us, but that are actually safe and protect the data of these countries in Africa and these users in Africa. So Aaron, back to you for a question that is kind of related to that. This is clearly a conversation that is bigger than just malaria and bigger than just foreign assistance. I mentioned at the beginning that we are inescapably in the middle of a trade war with China right now. Apparently, we're going to be sitting down with representatives from China and Europe in the coming days for early discussions. No one knows how that's going to play out. But I would be really curious for your perspective on how the party is viewing this moment strategically, because perhaps they view, and maybe you agree or disagree, maybe there's an opportunity for them to push in the realm of foreign assistance, as you've already mentioned. Maybe there's an opportunity to push in the realm of trade and how they approach their diplomacy. I know that you and a colleague of yours have written recently about how China's diplomacy has taken on a bit of a shift in 2025. Could you talk about that shift and how they're approaching this right now?
Yeah, for sure. I think when thinking about China's approach to foreign policy and diplomacy in general, I think you have to look at the biggest possible picture, which is the overall strategic direction that the party is going in. And the big thing that they're working towards is national rejuvenation by the middle of the century, 2049, which is the centenary of the founding of the People's Republic of China. And what that means is they want to be number one in terms of comprehensive national power by mid-century. So everything kind of flows from that. How do we get there as the ultimate goal? We've seen quite a lot in the early parts of this year, especially given the turnover in administration in the US and other kind of related sort of uncertainty in the world as a result of that, how to seize the opportunities, right? And I think, you've seen maybe a little bit more opening towards foreign business, meeting with executives, there's the visa programs, all these other kind of things to try and showcase, well, actually, we are open for business. We want to do deals, this kind of thing. We want to be more open to the rest of the world. And I think it's often easy to see this. You see this in Europe as well, right? There's the lifting of sanctions on members of the European Parliament and other organizations that happened recently, which is also done reciprocally. So the EU also lifted sanctions that they had on some party members. And there's been an explicit pitch for China to be the stable partner going forwards. Mm-hmm. You see this in Europe especially. There's been murmurings about trying to reinvigorate the Comprehensive Agreement on Investment, which was nixed in 2021, which was going to be a big EU-China trade deal. Unclear what's going to happen there. But there's definitely been a really consolidated effort to try and step into the breach diplomatically and make the case for China to be the kind of trustworthy, reliable partner for these countries going forwards. And now, as I said, I don't think that changes the overall strategy, right? I think, this is the convenient narrative for them to push at this moment in time, but that doesn't, at the end of the day, we should trust them by their rhetoric, not their actions. And you see this in the Africa case in particular. Africa is at the level of an all-weather comprehensive strategic partner, which is the highest level in their kind of very complex taxonomy of different kinds of strategic relationships. But actually, if you look at the data, Africa is not the priority location for a lot of foreign assistance, development work, investment. That's actually because of the risk profile and also some of the backlash that's happened in the last 5-10 years. There's actually more investment going to Latin America, Southeast Asia, other places. So rhetorically, China wants to be the leader of the global South. There are 50+ countries in Africa to work with. That carries weight at the UN and other international institutions. It makes sense to have them on board politically, but in terms of actual investment, economic strategy, it's not really where they're focused. And you see that reflected in Xi Jinping's leadership visits. So again, going back to the kind of political strategy, the foreign minister of the People's Republic of China for, I think, 34 years, come January, first visit of the year is always to Africa. But if you look at visits that Xi Jinping's done, he's gone to Africa, I think maybe 3 or 4 times in the last 10 years since he's been in power, compared to 20 plus for Europe, Russia, like every year pretty much, etc. So I think it's always worth having in mind what the rhetoric is and what the actual actions and policies, etc., underlying that are, and disaggregating between the two.
If there's anything that stands out to me from this conversation, it's number one, how interwoven this world is that we live in with great power competition and humanitarian work. Maybe that should be humanitarian and maybe should be separated away from geopolitical calculation in a perfect world. Clearly, that is not the world we live in. But we are entering into this new era that certainly in my age as a millennial, I was born in 1988. I was born a year before the wall came down. And I came of age in the 90s, a very luxurious time to be an American from a security perspective. And we are, I think, either at the cusp or already in this world that is going to be infused with questions of power, questions of influence that are going to be hotly contested in every single realm, going down into how you fight a deadly disease on the other side of the world in Africa. And I think we fool ourselves if the message we tell ourselves is that stuff either doesn't matter or it matters, but it's expendable. Because I think a second thing with that interwoven nature of this is it's not only interwoven in our reality, but it's interwoven with the Chinese Communist Party's ambition. They view this as an element of their grand strategy and an element of their way to displace America's influence. So there's 3 things that the former congressman talked about: being known, being liked, and being trusted. Those are they can't change the fact that America is known, but they can change the perception of America. Mm-hmm. And I think that also this question of what do we do moving forward, we also have agency on those things, whether we're liked, whether we are trusted. And we have agency with how we respond to what China is doing. So if there's anything we take away moving into this broader conversation now of Q&A, what is striking me is how integrated this is and how much a part of national security, foreign assistance, public health, and something as specific as malaria is going to be in U.S.-China relations moving forward. And with that, let's open this up. Any questions that we have from members who are here in person, please raise your hand. We have someone running microphones. And please, the only thing I will ask, make it a question and not a comment disguised as a question. Thank you. Right over here.
Hi, thank you so much. Totally questions. My name is Carmen Pan. I'm a global health reporter with Politico. Sorry, I think I'm struggling with a cold. So I have 2 questions, if I may. How do you square the sort of like Secretary of State, as you said, focus on China and on malaria and his confirmation hearing, with the fact that the State Department has decided to cut all funding to Gavi, which obviously is in the middle of deploying the malaria vaccine. Not perfect, but a new tool to fight malaria. And I was wondering if you sort of like can see how that funding cut for Gavi will impact the fight against malaria. And my second question, which is a bit more general, is talking to Republicans on the Hill. My feeling is that they feel that at times this sort of like soft power approach, funding countries to fight diseases like malaria, like HIV, hasn't necessarily resulted in sort of like a dividend for the United States. For example, Representative Brian Mass said, countries depending on us for decades to pay for their HIV drugs, in the case of PEPFAR, but then they still turn around and do business with China. So he feels that's not necessarily paying off in the U.S. having more influence and soft power in some of those countries that it's been supporting for a long time. So if you could just comment on those 2, I would be really grateful. Thank you.
Of course. All right, let's deal with Gavi first. When you look at that organization that's funded by many different nations, The United States, I think, has put in $1.3 billion over the course of the last 5-10 years, and we're limited. I think, or not limited, but the goal is not to go over 15%. All right, that $1.5 billion invested in the Gavi, they turn around about $4 billion from American manufacturers of vaccine. Before COVID, after COVID, or during COVID, they bought another $2 billion. So that's a $6 billion return on a $1.5 billion investment. But is that the important thing? Look at the work they did. Look at the boots on the ground, getting that out there. So those are just, to me, common sense things that we should invest, because we're burden sharing the cost of that. We're getting great results with that. They're doing the research and the implementation of what we really want to do. And our goal is we want to diagnose these things offshore as much as we can and hope they don't come here, and then address it over there. So that's dealing with Gavi. Your second part of your question was?
Is Republicans feeling they don't get the soft power dividend?
Yeah, Brian Mast. Sometimes it's hard to muddle through all that. What is the soft power? You'll notice when you don't know how much something is missed until you miss it. And I think you're going to see a lot of that. And I think going back to that, when you look at PEPFAR, we were having discussions before this administration came in, how long is something an emergency? PEPFAR, the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief. It's been, 25, 30, going on 30 years. How long is this an emergency? Where's the transition? And that was our whole goal when we created the DFC, was I wanted to move countries from aid to trade. And we should do that with a lot of our programs. In the NGO world and foreign assistance program, the goal ultimate would be to move countries from aid to trade or self-sufficiency. And I think more emphasis needs to be put on that.
And then I think you had a question about the impact of the vaccines on the fight against malaria. So I'd say, the RTSS vaccine that was created in 2021, and then the RT Matrix vaccine that came in 2023, both of those were technological revolutions, really. And I mean, they were a credit to the people who'd done work for years. They're both difficult vaccines to administer. They're partially effective, and they have a role. But I think when you talk about the overall impact on the malaria fight, they have a place. But from a cost perspective and an impact perspective, it's not. We should still use them, but I don't think that we're putting ourselves at a significant disadvantage with all the tools we have in our armamentarium.
I would just add to that. I'm not a U.S. citizen. I don't want to wade in on U.S. policy. It's also not something that I feel I have any expertise on. But looking at it from a kind of a global level, the impacts from the reductions in USAID and everything else will have their effect. But I think you can also see this as part of a broader global movement in terms of how countries approach foreign aid and assistance and their willingness to do so. Folding USAID into the State Department is basically something that we did in the UK, folding our development office into the FCO, now FCDO, a few years ago. You've also seen last year a number of other European countries reducing quite dramatically the amount of foreign assistance they're willing to do. And you also see this in China as well. As Ted was saying earlier, foreign policy is not necessarily a popular thing to prioritize. And that's the same in China as well, especially when they're facing a lot of economic difficulties. It's quite common to hear people say, well, why are we sending all this money abroad when we still have, they've officially eradicated poverty, but you still have a lot of very poor people in parts of China. There were times during the Mao era where they were sending, I think, 2% of GDP overseas in foreign assistance as part of their kind of gambit to foment global revolution. It's obviously much lower now, and it's getting smaller. You see this especially post-COVID. There's a lot less willingness to send money overseas because of the economic situation. There's been I think it's almost like a Trumpian spin, right? The focus on the Belt and Road on small and beautiful projects, which is kind of another way of saying we're not going to give you as much money anymore. I suppose the Trumpian spin would be to call it big and beautiful, but so.
Other questions? I have more if no one else does, but I want to defer to y'all first. Okay, well let me jump in. Ken, you mentioned something that I was hoping we would get the chance to circle back on. You talked about malaria as an early warning indicator, that as we combat malaria overseas, we have the opportunity to track and detect maybe proto-pandemics before they actually become a pandemic. How does that work? Like, what is it about fighting malaria that gives us that insight, that early warning indicator insight?
Sure. Great question. And I think it's a very straightforward answer. So when people get sick with malaria, one of the first symptoms they often have is fever. And so when they go and seek treatment, they present with fever. When people have many other illnesses, they also have fever and they will seek treatment. As we talked about, malaria is far and away the most common infectious disease that people will present with in these poor areas. And so if you're seeing a spike in fever that goes beyond what you would normally expect and you're not detecting malaria, you immediately can begin to investigate to see what's occurring. Now, I think there's something else that's worth pointing out here as we're talking about the influence of China. We have approached science with an openness and transparency that encourages data sharing and encourages cooperation. When you think about the way in which the Chinese operate in China and in Africa and elsewhere, data is not open, data is not transparent, and we are flying blind, so to speak, when we're trusting them in many cases. So there's a real reason that you want to have that early warning system in the hands of people who believe in that openness and transparency.
I mean, look no further than the last time we needed Beijing to be a reliable early warning indicator with COVID.
Yeah.
Right.
And what did they do? They cared more about containing information about the virus than they cared about containing the virus itself.
Right.
And it became a pandemic and Americans died. And honestly, perhaps that is the most intuitive touchstone for whether it's an American in your former district in Florida, Congressman. Every American lived through a pandemic. And that is something I don't think any of us thought we would ever experience in our lifetime, but we did. Mm-hmm. And it was connected to that, not just unreliability of the Chinese Communist Party, but the nature that this regime is so insecure and so brittle that they would feel the need to control information instead of controlling the disease.
Sure.
That to me is perhaps the most visceral proof. Aaron, yeah, you want to jump in here?
Yeah, and another strange aspect of China's health diplomacy, I have no idea how this plays out on the ground at all, but a big part of their Health Silk Road has also been to promote traditional Chinese medicine in Africa, even as a potential aid to curing malaria as well. There is a whole Xi Jinping thought on traditional Chinese medicine, so it's been kind of elevated as a kind of strategic construct in that way as well. And this is also about kind of China's civilizational influence in its role there. But I mean, I don't know how that plays out on the ground, but that is also a part of it. And I'm not sure how much we want to be trusting that.
Can I chime in on that?
Please do.
You were talking earlier about pharmaceuticals and APIs and things like that. China is wanting to set the standards for those things.
Yeah.
And this is something that's very dangerous. I'm going to throw out a couple books here. One is The Bully of Asia by Stephen Mosier. If you read that book, it gives you about a 5,000 history of China. It takes you from where they were, what the demise of them, and where they are, and what they want to do. And it's world hegemon. They want to control the world and set the systems for it, the standards. It'll be Chinese standards. The other book would be Rosemary Gibson's book, China RX. It goes back to what you brought up, and it reminded me of that because that book tells you all the nefarious things that are going on. You were talking about, like a statin drug for blood pressure. Say it's supposed to have 20 milligrams per tablet. Well, it may have 20 milligrams this month, but next month it might be 100 milligrams, or the next month it might be 10. So if you look at your response, it's up, it's down, it's waning, and so you lose trust in your doctor's confused. The other thing is the key starting ingredients or the active pharmaceutical ingredients that go in it, they're not to the standards we do. Here in our country, if I'm a manufacturer of pharmaceuticals, the FDA can show up anytime, anywhere, and you have to let them in. But in China, you have to make an appointment 4 to 6 weeks out. And they may be tracking a drug that we had when I was practicing veterinary medicine. We had dog food where the pets were dying from melamine, which is a toxic substance that was used as a protein supplement. and it was killing dogs, and it was in baby formula killing things, and it got tracked back. Well, by the time the FDA goes over there, the company that was making it, they shut down, and they move over here, so they'll say, well, they're out of business. We can't do anything about it. You look at fentanyl. The precursors are coming from China. This is a direct attack on the American people, and you brought that up too. It's Xi Jinping, I personally feel, is recreating the opium wars of the 1800s. I mean, we know where it's coming from, and so these things really need to change. And then there's the last thing, and this is the ideological divide. The world is splitting. You've got Chinese thought, and then you have, Western liberal ideologies. I met with David Stilwell when I was in Congress, and I says, it's like they have no morals. He goes, no, it's not that. He says they don't understand morals. They're amoralistic. He goes, they don't know what morals are. So, with 70 or since 1945 being brought up in a communist party where the ruling thought is the Communist Party, there is no higher power than that. There's a book written by Chris Stewart, who is a colleague of mine, called The Miracle of Freedom, The 7 Tipping Points That Saved the World. And just real briefly, the important part of that, it's a great book to read, but the salient point that comes out of that is the anthropologists and sociologists who study this stuff. So there's been approximately 100 billion people that have ever lived on the planet. 4.5% of them have ever lived in the liberty and freedom we are. That's 4.5 billion. The amazing part is 80% of us are alive today. That's how rare and fleeting the two systems have. And the choice is, which one do you want? Do you want where you have free thought, free expression, and things like that? Yeah, we've got a lot of problems here. We've got a lot of flux going on, but we need to work to make it right. And I truly believe through forums like this, or you going back, talking to your circle of influence, people are going to say, you know what, you're right. It does matter where I buy my stuff. It does matter who makes our pharmaceuticals. And so that's why we've got to get this right.
And to put a final point on that, it does matter who is leading these efforts
to
combat deadly diseases. It really matters because, as all of you have said in your own way, it's not just that the United States and the CCP approach foreign assistance differently. The world that we are trying to sustain is fundamentally opposed to the world that Beijing is trying to build.
There's no doubt about it.
Yes. Any final questions before we conclude? Yes.
Hi, I'm Margaret.
Oh, we have a microphone coming right behind you. Thanks.
Hi, Margaret with the UN Foundation, United to Beat Malaria, and thanks so much. It's been fascinating. I'm in advocacy, so it's been really challenging, obviously, in this environment to navigate all the changes, all the opaque information, and also encouraging Congress to step in. So I guess, and I know we've talked around it, but what can we do to ensure that the life-saving programs that we all understand are important for a lot of reasons, not just for lives abroad, but also for Americans' health, security, economic interests, as well as crafting the best way forward within the reorganized State Department? Like, what do you think are the best strategies, tactics, messages that will actually really break through both in Congress and in this administration? And specifically on this point, like, is there a one-pager about this, right, about the Health Road Initiative or the Health Silk Initiative, like something really tangible that we could also be sharing specifically about the influence of China would be super helpful in our advocacy work. So thanks so much.
Sure. Margaret, there's a lot of different information out there. I don't know if there's room on a one page to put it all on there. Are you with an NGO?
Yes.
All right. Have you been affected by the changes, I would assume, right?
Well, we don't receive USA funding, but the programs like PMI that we advocate for have, and the majority of FY24 funds still have not gone to even the programs that have been reinstated and deemed life-saving. I just got a memo that some money went out this morning, so that's good. It's slowly, surely, but it has been slow going, as you know.
It has been, and this, was this the right way to do it? I don't know. It probably could have been done better if we look back, but did it need to happen? Yeah. When I ran against the guy I ran when I first got elected in 2013 is when I came in. When he got into Congress in 88, our country owed $2.5 trillion in debt. When I ran against him, it was $10.5 trillion. I came up here to end that and fix that, but I failed miserably because when I left, we were pushing $20 trillion. We're at 36, 37, take your pick. And it is unsustainable. So do changes need to happen? Yeah. You're not going to cut your way out of solvency for this country. You have to grow your way. So it's going to be a combination. So going back to the groups you work with, they're going to have to redesign themselves. There's a great book called Built to Last, where companies go in and redesign themselves and come out. So the programs that they had, you're going to have to prove their worth. Were they effective? Were they efficient? If not, can you make them better and efficient? What was the payoff? What was the trade-off? How did it make America focus on safer, stronger, more prosperous? And you're going to have to sell that. And I think you're going to see these programs come back. The Malaria No More is an awesome program. I mean, we've got the tools, we know it works, and we know how to implement it. It's getting those countries that we go into to pick up the mantle and say, we're going to do this for our citizens, and we want to partner up with you because we know, like, and trust you.
I suppose the final thing I'll say, I have an op-ed coming out tomorrow on this exact topic of China and fighting malaria. So that we'll share widely and can flag that for you separately. Everyone, thank you so much for coming. I'm grateful again that Hudson had the opportunity to host, to convene, and I'm especially thankful to this incredible panel for your expertise and for your wisdom. So thank you for coming, and to everyone, thank you for joining us. Appreciate it.
Thank you, everybody.